14 Bannerman Road is where Sarah Jane Smith lived.
And 14 Bannerman Road is the name of my podcast about it. This time, Death of the Doctor Parts 1 and 2, both written by Russell T Davies, in only his second and final official writing credit for the show, and directed by Ashley Way, a new director for the show, who previously directed episodes of Doctor Who and Torchwood. Part 1 was first broadcast on the 25th of October 2010, Part 2 was first broadcast on the 26th of October 2010. Once again, if you're listening on the date of intended upload, Part 1 was broadcast exactly 11 years ago today. Before we start, I kind of want to touch on the end of the last episode where Geeta's memories were erased. I've been wondering exactly how much was erased, because if her memory of aliens was erased entirely, then we have to hope that Haresh never brings up that he saw them again, or she'd have no idea what he was on about. I imagine she was just kind of reset to the point that she was at prior to the episode, where both Haresh and Geeta have seen Junoon and Vale, but everything from Geeta spotting Andrew back to the driveway onwards is erased. But I wonder if we'll ever get official confirmation. Probably not in this episode, though. But hey, I'm very excited for this episode. So let's begin with 13 Bannerman Road, etc., as we always do. And then Sarah Jane, Rani, and Clyde on a video call to Luke. Luke winds up Clyde by going on about how he's met this guy called Sanjay, who might just be the best friend he's ever had. Clyde looks very dejected before it is revealed to be a tease. It's a tad mean, really, but he takes it well, and it shows more of the progression of Luke's character. Interrupted by an alarm from Mrs. Smith warning of armed forces converging on 13 Bannerman Road. They are indeed in big black vans. Haresh, who is watering the garden, watches on as they disembark in their signature red berets and big scary looking guns. Hello, unit. Sarah Jane is unfazed. She tells them to stop before they enter her property because she won't have any soldiers there, and they obey her. And the Colonel informs Sarah Jane that her friend, the Doctor, is dead. Ronnie and Clyde reject it immediately, but the Colonel says that his body was returned to Earth last Sunday. Unit ran DNA tests and confirmed him to be a Time Lord, specifically the Doctor, and she's very sorry for their loss, but the Doctor is dead. We just see Sarah Jane's face. She doesn't say anything, and we roll titles. Now, of course, you can't kill the Doctor. You most certainly can't kill the Doctor in a spin-off. That is ridiculous. And so the mystery lies now in how the Doctor can be dead without actually being dead. I'll admit, I can't really remember at this point, so I'm very intrigued. The Colonel, who's now been invited into the attic, goes on to say that the Doctor's body was found 10,000 light years away by the Shan Sheath, who returned him to Earth. They act as a sort of galactic undertakers, and they sent UNIT a Shan Sheath epitaph stone. It's unclear if it was sent directly to them or if it was with the Doctor's body, but Mr. Smith confirms that Shan Sheath do that. Sarah Jane tells him to shut up, pretty much. It's interesting that in a previous episode, Sarah Jane tried to conceal Mr. Smith from UNIT. I can imagine that she's acting a little off because of the news, but I also imagine that the Colonel is making lots of mental notes about that talking computer on the wall. Mr. Smith plays the recording on the stone. We see a hologram of a Shan Sheath. He's a large vulture-like creature dressed in a purple robe that conceals what I imagine are wings, so it gives it sort of a hunchbacked appearance. This one has blue gems in its forehead, and the face actually looks better than I remembered. Compared to all the detail that is in Androvax's scales, I kinda just remember the Shan Sheath as looking a bit like they're made out of spam, but the detail in this one's skin is actually pretty great. Once again, I long for the era where the costume and props people made all these great aliens. Also, of course, they're undertakers, death, etc. Of course, they're going to be vulture-like creatures, aren't they? So the Shan Sheath says, "I bring condolences," and then Sarah Jane pauses the recording and says, "Look, I don't trust this guy. Just look at him." And Ronnie says, "That's not fair. Since when do we judge by appearances?" I would like to point you in the direction of the end of Series 3. To be fair, Rani is the only one to have consistently upheld her stance that everyone deserves a chance, which is why she is so good. Sarah Jane does basically admit that she is lashing out in grief. She lets it continue playing. The Shan Sheath says that they found the Doctor's body on the wastelands of the Crimson Heart, where the Doctor perished defending 500 children from the Scarlet Monstrosity. As he was the last of his kind, but he spoke very fondly of Earth, they returned him to Earth. Now, we know he wasn't the last of his kind, but Russell T Davies didn't even know what Moffat was planning then. I don't think Moffat knew what Moffat was planning then. Time is wibbly, so let's gloss over all that and say that this checks out. I doubt the Shang Chief have a confession dial and billions of years to smash through it to get him into that pocket dimension anyway. The Colonel says that they will hold the funeral in conjunction with the Shang Chief in Unit Base 5 inside Mount Snowdon, and transport and accommodation can be provided. I don't know why I like her saying that so much. I guess it's just like a really mundane thing, but they're talking about a funeral in a mountain base, a funeral of an alien. But it's just, yeah, we can provide transport and accommodation. Of course we can. It's quite nice. It's a very Doctor Who sentence. Ronnie pops home and Haresh asks what's going on, and Ronnie just hugs him and tells him not to go anywhere. Sarah Jane later that day gets on a video call with Luke and says that she always thought that she'd be able to feel if the Doctor died. And Luke says in the kindest possible way that that's very poetic but doesn't really mean anything. But Sarah Jane is convinced that he isn't actually dead. It's the next day, and Haresh is giving very important advice to Ronnie and Clyde that Sarah Jane is probably in denial, and we just have to support her through this, but ultimately wait it out, and she will go through the stages of grief, and eventually she's going to come out okay. We need to just be there for her and do what we can. He delivers it a lot better than I have here. Presumably, Ronnie told him that a friend of Sarah Jane's died without going into too much detail, but a unit car pulls up to take Sarah Jane, Clyde, and Ronnie to Wales. I guess Haresh just thinks that they're going to provide Sarah Jane support as they were so close, which is a little weird, but it's kind of plausible enough. Clyde actually gets a zap from the car, which is brushed off as static electricity, but it looks distinctly more Archron. The base is crazy looking. It's like they've mixed a painting with real footage rather than CGI, but it's sort of, well, hey, somehow we've come into some CGI money. Let's go. I imagined it to be a lot more hidden, but it's big old dishes and protrusions from the rock on the outside, and then a big old tunnel that leads into the mountain. I wonder what's happened to the base now, because Unit is arguably mostly kind of shut down, and this is Unit Base 5. What's the deal with the other at least 4 bases? Also, didn't they have a helicarrier? I feel like I've said this before. I've probably said this before when they've popped up before. But, I mean, it looks cool. If you can sort of use your imagination on it a little bit and accept that it's real, and it looks like a very weird painting. A very good but very weird painting. It's pretty cool. So the Colonel's there. She greets them and says that unfortunately the Brigadier can't make it because he's still in Peru, which I believe was the reason that he couldn't make Sarah Jane's wedding, and it does indicate that unfortunately Nicholas Courtney wasn't well enough. And also that Liz Shaw, who was a companion of the Third Doctor, who went on to work for UNIT, was stuck on their moon base. They've got a moon base. UNIT have got a moon base. They've got. Is that one of the other 4? Is that higher than 5? Is it a separate convention altogether? Is it? But they've got a moon base. This is why I love UNIT. They're so military, but they are like unlimited funding, which allows them to have the space rockets and moon bases, and it's quite cool. It's quite cool. Don't like the guns, but it's quite cool. Now, of course, you may think, oh, well, they've brought up Liz Shaw. Obviously, they brought up the Brigadier before in the show, so it makes sense to reference him again. But they brought up Liz Shaw. Nice little acknowledgement of a past companion. Unlikely that the kids that are watching are going to pick up on it, but good one for the parents. Far from the last, as we will eventually see. Now, the real world reason for her not appearing was because Caroline John, who played her, had died back in 1996. So it was nice to keep her character going, but it does mean that they can't really bring her back in any way that isn't just a reference. So in order to mention her, they have to mention that she's elsewhere, which is a little interesting at least. So they turn a corner, and the gang are all shocked to discover 3 Grasky working away. But wait, they're blue. The Colonel says that they're Grosky, not Grasky, and one of them walks up to them and says, "We're very different, actually." The Colonel says that they were stranded on Earth in 2006, so UNIT took them in, which kind of seems like UNIT went, "Ooh, free labour." and the Grosky reveal that they've built an entire rocket, and units say that it'll be used to take the Doctor's remains to space in a lead-lined coffin. First up, Unit built the Doctor a whole rocket. Second up, we get to see it. All I can say is CGI budget, and I am impressed. The previous one looked like a painting, but this, it looks pretty legit. We got a whole mountain base, and we got a rocket, and I'm surprised because I know that at this point we're only 1 year out of the global recession. So, wow! Series 4, bang! We're getting CGI now. Sarah Jane asks where the TARDIS is, and they say that there was no sign of it. The Shan Sheath say that the body was found alone. The Grosky says that Clyde, in particular, smells. And they kind of just brush it off with Clyde basically saying, you're short. But, I mean, Ronnie doesn't approve of that, but hey, Grosky started it. Colonel, Sarah Jane, and Ronnie go off to the Gathering of Remembrance, but the Grosky pulls Clyde aside and says he smells of time. Clyde looks at his hand, which is still all a crackle, and the Grosky says, he's coming. He's coming, is he? Ooh, wonder who he is. I'll give you 3 guesses. At the Gathering, there are 3 Shan Sheath, and they're distinguished by the gems in their heads. One's got red, one's got yellow, one's got blue. The coffin is there, looking very sturdy, and there are 4 people in black, who the Colonel says are old unit soldiers. Sarah Jane asks, may I see the Doctor? And the Colonel says, you probably wouldn't want to. And Sarah Jane asks, what are you hiding? She explains that the Doctor was, in her own words, hurt. And it seems now that Sarah Jane might finally accept his death. She says that she doesn't even know what face he's wearing, and then she asks Ronnie and Clyde to leave her for a moment so that she can gather her thoughts. So they go and they sit on the other side of the room. A Shan Sheath plays the harp and asks them to remember, and we get a flashback to what I believe is a school reunion, as Sarah Jane remembers the 10th Doctor. We see Ronnie remembering him in the wedding episode. We see Clyde do that as well, but particularly the part where he absorbed the Archon energy from the TARDIS. He's sort of opens his eyes, looks at his hand again. We come back to Sarah Jane, and we get footage of the 4th and 3rd Doctors, and I think, well, the Doctor can't be dead, but they're really committing to this funeral. They've brought out the archive footage. We're sitting here, we're having a moment of remembrance. Suddenly, smash. A vase breaks on the floor. We see Jo Grant, the 3rd Doctor's companion after this show, has entered and immediately dropped it. She's very talkative. She's apologising, saying how she brought flowers, which is silly, really, but they were so lovely. As was the vase, which was hand blown, but not actually hand blown because glass does get quite hot, so they don't actually touch it with their hands, do they? And then the Shan Sheath cut her off. She's got one of her grandsons in tow. She realises that everyone's looking at her. Sarah Jane looks at her with a hint of recognition, and she apologises for making so much noise before going off about a tribe who actually sing all night at funerals, and Sarah Jane just laughs to herself. And when Jo comes over and asks if they know each other, Sarah Jane says, well, we never actually met, but you're Jo Jones, aren't you? And Jo says, well, it's been a long time since I was Jo Jones, because I got married and I became Jo Grant. And Sarah Jane says, well, I came along later, and I heard all the stories about you. And Jo says, you must be Sarah Jane. I've heard a lot of stories about you too. She gives Sarah Jane a hug and a kiss on the cheek, and we go over to the grandson, who is apologising to Ronnie and Clyde about Jo. Ronnie says, hey, she looks fantastic, and introduces herself. Clyde does the same, and the grandson reveals that his name is Santiago, and he says he was named after where he was born, and he mentions that he's always travelling because his mum and dad got that tendency from Jo. He mentions the trek that he's had to get there today, and basically just how exciting his life is, and it makes Clyde and Ronnie saying, oh, we're from Ealing, sound quite plain in comparison. The Shan Sheath, in the politest possible way, basically tells them to shut up. This is a remembrance. Can we have some respect, please? Jo does not shut up. She talks to Sarah Jane about her 7 kids. She's got 12 grandkids, there's another one on the way. And Sarah Jane says, well, I've got a son. And they get to talking about how the Doctor showed them such wonders that it really took them quite a while to get over it when he left. And then Sarah Jane mentions that when he came back, it taught her that the life that she wanted was right under her nose, actually. And Joe says, wait, he came back recently? And Sarah Jane realizes that she might have said something that she shouldn't have. I I don't know what Joe was like in the era of the Third Doctor, but I do very much like Katie Manning's performance in this episode. I I mean, it's just a great thing to see a companion come back, isn't it? It's like it's the entire concept of Sarah Jane Adventures. It's Sarah Jane is back, as good as ever. Joe's also back, and I imagine as good as ever. The sort of switch from just constant motor mouth to really uh, uh, quite pained but hiding it. When, oh, the Doctor came back, but he didn't come back to see me. Oh, okay. That sort of that little switch there. It's pretty good. It's pretty good. So in trying to play off the oh, it was just a coincidence. He just happened to be, we just bumped into each other, and just Sarah Jane lets slip that she's actually seen him more than once, and Joe just smiles sadly and says, "Well, he must have really liked you." She then mentions the exact thing that Sarah Jane said, that she always thought that she would have felt it if the Doctor had died, and she has an inkling that the Doctor still lives. Sarah Jane and Joe hug again, because they are now adamant that there is some foul play going on. Joe also drops a reference to Metabelus 3, which I'm fairly certain is the spider planet, but I'm too arachnophobic to really confirm. After the gathering of remembrance, Joe and Sarah Jane go to their quarters, trying to figure out who might want to fake the Doctor's death, bonding over both having visited the planet Peladon on separate occasions with separate incarnations of the Doctor. Ronnie, Clyde, and Santiago all just believe that they are deep in denial. They think, well, the Doctor has to die at some point. It's happened now, and these companions who went traveling with him for so long, they're in denial, and maybe they'll get over it at some point. But right now, no, he is dead, isn't he? Clyde says, "I wish he wasn't, though. I wish he was here, because he could explain this Archeron energy in my hand." And then he tells Santiago about how it happened, and Santiago says, "Hey, you think my life is cool? Have you heard yours? Yours sounds pretty exciting." And Ronnie says, "Hey, why didn't you tell me about the Archeron energy? That seems quite important." He says, "I didn't really get a chance around all the unit people. They'd probably lock me up and dissect me." Fair point. Agrosky walks by, and he says that the smell is getting closer, and Clyde asks what he knows, and he just runs off and ducks into a vent. So the three kids pursue. It's funny, Santiago seems to be acting as quite a good stand-in for Luke here. If only his hair wasn't so curly, he could fit right in. The Shan-Sheath reveal that they aren't as benevolent as they seem, with the lead one, with the blue gems, saying that the harp that he was playing has revealed that the two wise women remember the Doctor the most fondly, and they have to keep playing the harp so they can evoke more memories of days gone if they are to succeed. They have this sort of wibbly pale blue orb that gives them a view of Sarah Jane and Joe in their quarters writing notes together. We see that they both fall into this sort of trance of remembrance as they hear the harp music that's being played. Uh, I think it's playing, they sort of hear it go through the vents, but I imagine they play it over speakers or something rather than just playing it down a vent. But with the camera sort of flips down the vent that Clyde, Ronnie, and Santiago are now crawling through. So it seems also the harp is you can selectively target who you play it to, because otherwise Clyde, Ronnie, and Santiago would be hearing it as well. And so we get lots of references to past adventures, left, right, and centre. Just Joe and Sarah Jane going through them, and Clyde gets to a sort of grill in the vent, sees the Shan-Sheath, and wonders exactly what they're up to. He overhears them saying that this will drain Sarah Jane and Joe's memories and it will kill them. But then they sort of crack a joke among themselves about that at least there are some excellent undertakers on hand. And then Clyde relays this to Ronnie and Santiago before his hand lights up with the energy, gives his position away through the grill in the vent, and they have to shuffle backwards through the vent for their lives as Sarah Jane and Joe snap from the trance, sense something is very wrong. Both groups end up bumping into each other and band up together, and Clyde tells them what he heard, and Joe says, "Ha! This proves that the Doctor is still alive." And Clyde replies, "Of course I'm alive," with the 11th Doctor's voice. The Doctor, speaking through Clyde, reveals that he's keyed into the residual Archeron energy that was within Clyde, and it's allowed him to authorize a biological swap. Just science fiction, just science. It's just, hey, the doctor's here, wibbly wibbly. Clyde's whole body zaps with energy, and he's back to himself for a moment, very shocked that it wasn't him speaking. And then he looks at his hand, which isn't his. He explicitly says, "My hand's not white," which is a line that I remember pretty well, actually. I don't know where that one, but and then bam, he's morphing between himself and the 11th Doctor. It seems to be a pretty painful process as the energy zaps all over them, and then there he is, Matt Smith, the 11th Doctor, my Doctor, really. I did start watching in Series 3 with Tennant, but Series 5 with Smith is where I started going all in, and then I went back and I watched Series 1 through 4. I mean, he's going to steal the show, isn't he? Of course he is. It's just like Tennant did in Wedding. Of course, he's turned up at the end of part 1, like Wedding 2. Ronnie wants to know who he is, what he's done with Clyde, and because, of course, last time I saw him, he was in his 10th incarnation. 10th in inverted commas. And so, with his motor mouth that's running far faster than his brain, he reveals that they swap places, so Clyde is in quite a bit of trouble, actually. We cut to Clyde, we see him call out for the Doctor, standing on a crimson planet, more accurately, Aquarian whales tinted red. And Sarah Jane senses, well, that this man is obviously the Doctor, isn't he? Joe's a little taken aback that his face is so young. He rather cheekily replies that from his perspective, by comparison to how she looked when he last saw her, it's as if she's been baked. Santiago reminds them that the Shansheath are in fact still pursuing, and we see them round the corner. Rather than running, the Doctor walks right up to them, says, "Ah yes, the Claw Shansheath of the 15th Funeral Fleet, I've been looking for you. Have you been telling people that I'm dead?" The Shansheath, in his best Polish villainous voice, says that there was a mistake. The death notice was sent out a little too early, but that can be rectified. I'm so sorry for your loss, Doctor. Rest in peace. Red energy fires out of his hand, zaps the Doctor square in the chest. He falls to his knees. We roll the credits. Overall, I think the tone of this part 1 has been a little bit too humorous. There have been some jokes in there that I haven't mentioned. I've just sort of blitzed through, but I think a bit more time of everybody mourning would have sold it a little better. But maybe they know we don't believe the Doctor's dead, so they've gone, okay, let's reveal the Shansheath, reveal them they're evil, let's get into sort of the meat of the story. Also, constraints of a kids show probably mean that you can't make kids too sad or something. And you got to admit, plot-wise, it's pretty good. We need some memories of the Doctor, so let's fake a death and then come and have everyone remember him. I love it. As for what they need the memories for, well, we don't yet know, so that's what part 2 is for, so let's roll it. And all together now, we do the 13 Bannerman Road, we do the previously on, we roll the titles, as every part 2 does, and then we re-establish that Clyde is on this red planet. He's looking at a machine that is making countdown sort of noises. It goes ding, and Clyde is swapped back out for the Doctor with some very lucky timing. Thankfully, the Shansheath doesn't continue to zap Clyde. I guess he's in shock that the Doctor has just suddenly been replaced. Clyde turns around to start explaining what's just happened to Sarah Jane. She says, "Run. We've got no time for that now. Run." We whip pan transition back to the Doctor, who's now in Clyde's place, back on the planet where he was originally. There's about a second maximum of him with the machine, then a noise that could be interpreted as him swapping back, and then when we next see the Doctor, it's him running past Sarah Jane. The pace is frantic, but Sarah Jane appears as shocked as we are, so we can see, unexpectedly, he's managed to get it to swap back. The Doctor's now back in the room. Clyde is very unhappy about all of this, back on the planet, begging the machine to take him back. The Doctor guides everyone into a room that looks like the sleeping quarters, in time to bump into the Colonel. I was just beginning to wonder where all the unit employees were. He slams the door in her face. It seems like she doesn't recognise him. And he tells Sarah Jane to sonic it, because they took his screwdriver. It's a shame. I really liked that screwdriver. I want to see it as much as possible. It's just such a good design. I like it extend and pop out with little claws on it. What are the claws for? Who knows? But they're great. It looks kind of at least the most screwdrivery, doesn't it? With a little like a crosshead. It's just all green and kind of bronze and silver. It's just perfection. I guess it's kind of also the screwdriver from the series where I really got into it as well. So you have your Doctor. I guess I've also got my screwdriver and my TARDIS interior. His TARDIS interior is my favorite as well. It's just kind of the first one you see, the one you fall in love with. Um, so he takes Sarah Jane and Joe's hands. He says, "Hey, do you remember the good old days when we go zooming off to faraway worlds?" Swaps out for Clyde again. He uses Sarah Jane's lipstick on the machine, sets to work on it, so that it doesn't just keep switching them in and out, and it actually runs properly. Sarah Jane and Joe look around the wasteland of the Crimson Heart, as it's called, to this planet. All I can say, again, is CGI budget. It stretches off into the distance as an alien landscape with large moons or other planets in the sky and some either crashed ship or half buried structure or whatever out in the distance. It would look better in higher definition, I imagine. It's quite blurry out there in the distance, but it's pretty neat. Still pretty neat. I like they've taken this quarry and they've gone, bam, fill in a background alien landscape. Pretty cool. Back in the unit base, the Colonel knocks on the door with the Shansheath beside her. Rani says that she must be in league with them because someone on the inside of unit must have faked the DNA results. Now, the Colonel actually gave her name at the very start of episode 1, but I've just been calling her the Colonel, I think. It kind of felt fitting alongside, you got the Brigadier, you call her the Colonel. But Ronnie reminds us that her name is Colonel Kareem, so I'm going to call her Colonel Kareem from now on. She triggers a lockdown aiming to trap the kids in the room, but Agroski pops open the vent and says, "Follow me." The Shansheath leader instructs the others to dispense with the coffin. They just kind of move it over to the side and out the way and prepare the room for the coalescence. He pulls back a curtain, and behind a very dramatic cloud of smoke is the TARDIS. The Doctor and Sarah Jane work on the machine. Sarah Jane asks him if the regeneration hurt. He says it always hurts, and given that he came into this world shouting in pain, that kind of checks out. As far as I can remember, he changes into his face and just goes, "Ah!" You don't need a explanation from me of what shouting in pain is. He says that he's travelling with Amy and Rory, but he dropped them off on a honeymoon planet, which isn't actually a planet for honeymooning. It's a planet that is on a honeymoon because it married an asteroid. Very Doctor Who line. It's a kind of Russell T Davies Doctor Who line, especially. Brilliant kind of little joke type thing there, but also going, "Hey, well, this is an alien world, an alien show. Some planets are alive and get married, and it's great." He says the Doctor. He says the Shansheath took the TARDIS, but he was able to cobble together this machine from all the junk that is on the planet. There is indeed a lot of junk lying around. And you know how I like it when they build a machine. I very much enjoyed when Sarah Jane built that machine that shot all the stuff into the clouds that time. You remember that? But leaving the Doctor stranded on a planet with some tech laying around seems like a huge underestimation by the Shansheath of his ability to cobble it all together into something. So Joe picks up that the Doctor is travelling now with a married couple, and she says, "Oh, I only left because I wanted to go and get married, actually." And she says that when she was off travelling the Amazon, she came across this place with a phone. Only phone for miles. And she decided to phone unit. And they informed her that the Doctor had left. And he said that he'd see her again, he'd come back. So she thought that maybe one day she might hear the TARDIS, even out in the rainforest. But she never did. And she considers herself a bit stupid for waiting for him. He says, "Joe, it was hard to track you down." And he lists all the wild things that she's done. Sailing down the Yangtze in a tea chest as one of them. And so he lets on that you might have been watching her. And when she says, "Hey, were you watching me?" He says, I wasn't watching you, actually. But when my 10th incarnation was dying, and I went on my farewell tour," doesn't actually say those words, but it's sort of how you refer to it. "He went to find every companion that he could, not just his recent ones, and he found out about her, and he even mentions that her 13th grandkid, who's yet to be born now, uh, will have dyslexia, but he's going to be great with it. He's actually going to be a great swimmer, and therefore, maybe the way I read this is that he's implying that sure he hasn't come back for it yet because he's going to come back for her in the future, but as a past incarnation of himself, because time travel is an interesting thing. And then Sarah Jane, from somewhere, I have no idea where at all. Oh, it might be K9's whistle, actually, thinking about it. No, but then wouldn't it be too high pitched for. I can't remember if that was an audible whistle or not. But from somewhere, she's acquired a whistle. Just for this one scene in this episode, she's acquired a whistle and uses it to get the Doctor and Joe's attention and says, hey, the rest of the folk on Earth is still kind of in danger with all the Shanshith. So this is a nice little reunion, whatever, but should probably go back and help. The Doctor uses one of the many exotic tinctures that Jo has in her bag on the machine, and then it seems good to go. Now, the Grosky has taken the kids. I'll be referring to them as the kids. They're kind of teenagers, but Clyde, Rani, and Santiago. He's taken them to his little den, where he's got some pizza. The same brand pizza, Jubilee Pizza, so I've been informed, as was in Torchwood, which means that the Whoniverse has invented this Welsh pizza chain that has obviously got a branch down in Cardiff, down where Torchwood is by the Rift, and it's got a branch up more around Mount Snowdon, is able to deliver pizza to Unit, and the Groski's been nicking it or ordering it himself, and he's been eating it in his den. And I love that. I love that the Groski's eating pizza in his den, but I love especially that he's eating the same brand Torchwood pizza. That's great. That's great. I'm not sure how many crossovers we've really had with Torchwood or references to Torchwood in Sarah Jane Adventures, if we've had any. But that's a really neat little one. Turns out the Grosky doesn't really have a plan. He just kind of wants to share his pizza with them, which is very sweet, if unhelpful. And unfortunately, it does kind of lead to a bad situation, as we will see. So, Ronnie, Clyde, and Santiago, they kind of talk about how weird their lives are. And as Ronnie and Clyde mention how odd it is to keep it hidden from their parents, Santiago mentions that he hasn't actually seen his parents in about 6 months because of all the stuff that they're up to all over the world with protesting and exploring and such. He says his father is with the Gay Dads organisation climbing a mountain, possibly Everest, I think, which is just a neat little mention of some representation in one little easily missable line. You could entirely just sort of gloss over that, but just mention that his dad's gay, and it's just, yeah, that's neat. Quite enjoy that as well. And then the vent. I'm not sure if this is how vents work. I'm not a vent technician or whatever the word for that is, but it seals up. A kind of metal thing rises up where the grate was and seals it off. And the temperature in this little den starts to rise. And this is where we see Colonel Kareem at her most villainous, intentionally increasing the temperature, presumably so that she can boil these 3 teenagers and 1 alien to death. The Shanshith even tells her the kids are irrelevant and she should just leave them locked in there, to be honest. Just don't kill them, you don't need to. Even though the Shanshith actually were quite happy to kill off Sarah Jane and Jo, I think when it comes to children, they're like, you're going a bit far. But she says, hey, these are important to the Doctor, so they have to die. Unit has seemed to have a bit of an issue with evil folk being able to infiltrate their ranks. They've had a Bane get in before. Maybe that's why they got shut down, actually. Also, I've just realised that Bane can make themselves look human. Slitheen can, even though it requires murder. They sort of scoop out a human. And then Vale can possess a human and thus take their appearance. It's an interesting theme. It's interesting that we've had 3 aliens across the course of Sarah Jane Adventures able to do that and blend in. It does make it quite sinister if you don't really know who they are. They kind of, get into places and you can't really trust anyone, kind of thing. It's quite a cool idea. Having fixed the machine so that it doesn't even need to swap out with Clyde now, which I thought, okay, wow, you've just made a teleporter now. You've turned it into a biological swapper or whatever it was to just a full-on teleporter. Well done. The Doctor, Jo, and Sarah Jane teleport back. They immediately hear the kids crying out for help through the vent, even though it's sealed up, they can still hear them. And Sarah Jane zaps her cover, and the Doctor goes in first, saying the ventilation shafts, well, they take me back, or maybe even forwards, because he's unable to resist a joke. Also, a reference, ventilation shafts take me back, regarding the Fourth Doctor story, The Hand of Fear. I had to look that up. The kids watching aren't going to get these references unless they are impossibly nerdy. I think Russell T Davies is just sitting there writing them for his own amusement. You know what? I'm happy to let him. I'm happy for him to sit back and recall the time that he watched the Fourth Doctor story where he crawled through a vent, and now he gets to make the 11th Doctor crawl through a vent, and he's sitting there rubbing his hands with glee. It's just a fan alter. This is this episode. It's that. That's what this episode is for. It's sitting there and going, hey, you remember that? Yeah, I remember that. That was a good time, wasn't it? He. Now, before Sarah Jane and Jo can follow along through the vent, they're caught by the Shan-Sheath, which leaves the Doctor with the horrible decision of having to go and save them or going to save the kids. We were just joking seconds ago, but suddenly this has got very serious. The Doctor decides to go for the kids, with Kareem noting that it's the wrong choice, as he could come out and he could be stopping her, but it's exactly the choice that she predicted he would make. Sarah Jane and Jo are hauled into the room where she is, the room with the TARDIS in, the room with the Shan-Sheath in, and they get dumped into the memory weave. Now, the Doctor is able to twiddle some wires in the vent and get the vent door released. He's sort of, hi, I'm the Doctor, I'm the solution to the problem in this episode. It's a Sarah Jane episode, so they're kind of the ones that come up against the problems. I don't know exactly how to word it, but in Wedding of Sarah Jane Smith, Sarah Jane was more out of the picture, so the Doctor was more stumped and tried to get her back. This has just got a bit of a different feeling to it. I guess with so many more characters in as well. You've even got the Grosky tagging along, obviously Santiago and Jo. There's you can't really have everyone facing an issue. You have to kind of band them together and go, okay, well, Doctor knows what to do. As the Doctor shuffles backwards through the vent, as he can't turn around, even though, I'm going to be honest with you, they look quite spacious, and he's followed by the kids, Clyde goes first again. And so he's sort of interrogated by Clyde, who actually hasn't been able to see him till now because of all the swapping. Clyde asks if he's always white every regeneration, and the Doctor responds, no, I can be anything. Now, up until this point, he has been always white. Up until this point right now, when I record this podcast, the Doctor has been white every regeneration. But we do actually get this confirmed in a 12th Doctor episode later in Moffat's era, when, as far as I can remember, the Doctor shoots a Time Lord, forcing them to regenerate, and they go from a white man to a black woman. Obviously, the regeneration always hurts thing was kind of thrown out by the wayside then, or the 12th Doctor was feeling particularly cruel. But, I mean, yeah, so the Doctor themselves, their main incarnations have always been way up to this point. Yes, we've had the Fugitive Doctor, that leads to a whole thing, but it just feels weird that this is quite an important bit of trivia here. And then it's immediately followed up by, how many times can you regenerate? 507. Now, we know this isn't the case. We know that it's 12, meaning that the Doctor can have 13 incarnations in one go, in one set of incarnations. And because of the War Doctor and because of Ten's whole clone hand thing, the 11th Doctor is actually the 13th, meaning that he's on his last one and he needs to be granted a new cycle by the Time Lords, which you see all that happen in later episodes of Doctor Who. So the way I interpret this is that if the Doctor were to tell the truth, it would invite further questions, and he probably doesn't want to get into it right now. So giving a random high number answers the question while being significantly dismissive. Russell T Davies apparently clarified later that he was making a joke, but it just feels weird to follow the truth with a joke right after. It's just got a weird feel, that scene. Sarah Jane and Jo, who are now strapped into this memory weave with the flashy, like, bleeping headbands that are on, they ask what this is all in aid of. And Colonel Kareem says that it makes memories, and it makes them real, and the Shansheath instructs them to remember the TARDIS key. So here's the big old plan. They got the TARDIS, and then they realised that they've got no way of getting in, which I quite enjoy that as well. I quite enjoy. Okay, we got the time machine. Ah, we don't have the key. That just feels. It just feels like a great flaw, doesn't it? Oh, damn, we can't get through the doors. It's just great. It really amuses me. I like it a lot. So the Shansheath leader goes on to say that they've seen so much death over and over again, and if they had a time machine at their disposal, they might finally be able to put a stop to it. So they don't even seem all that evil then. They just seem kind of terribly misguided. Sarah Jane is quick to point out that this is actually a really bad idea that'll wreck the universe. I also find it funny that they were prepared to do some murder in order to stop death. Um, but I wonder what Kareem will get out of this, or if she's just kind of fallen prey to this way of thinking too. Sarah Jane immediately asks Kareem what she gets out of this. Same brain, we're on that same wavelength. And she says that she gets a bigger horizon out of it. The Shansheath have agreed to take her to the stars because there's nothing left for her on Earth anymore. Alluding to some past event that has occurred. What happened to her? What happened in her past? I want to know. Well, what means that she's got nothing left for her on Earth? Oh, I would very much like to know the answer to that. I'm not going to get it. So, the memory weave is fully activated as the Doctor, Rani, Clyde, Santiago, and the Grosky run up to the door. They find it closed. Sarah Jane just shouts the plan through the door, and the Doctor shouts back that I've got the original key in my pocket and I'll hand it over if you let Sarah Jane and Joe go. I quite enjoy that as well. He managed to take his sonic screwdriver but didn't manage to get the key out of his pocket. That'll be explained later, actually. So, as the memory weave does its thing, we get some zooms in on Sarah Jane's and Joe's faces as they try in vain to fight it. And we see the TARDIS, and we zoom through the keyhole of the TARDIS into memories of the 10th Doctor, memories of the 4th Doctor, the 3rd Doctor with the 2nd Doctor, so it must be from the episode The Three Doctors. We've got the 1st Doctor on the screen. The Shansheath has a control panel, and it's got a big dial on it and a little display of a key, and it's kind of filling up, and energy shoots from both Sarah Jane and Joe's headbands, and it meets in the middle, and it starts forming into a key as the gang outside the doors asks the Doctor, what are we going to do? Now, rather than just shouting through a door, he's managed to patch himself into the communications and instructs Sarah Jane and Joe to remember, but to remember everything. Everything that you have ever seen on your travels with me, every monster, every planet, every second of it. We are greeted with incredibly brief flashbacks of so many different stories and monsters and doctors and planets that if I were to go through and list all of them, I would be here forever. Notably, we see the Brigadier's face in there. Both Sarah Jane and Joe out loud say, I remember, and then this is really quite, look how much Doctor Who there is, but I quite like it. It's quite a celebration of the show. We see a dial on the control panel start heading into the red. The memory weave starts overloading. There are sparks, and the key fades away as Kareem shouts at the Shansheath to bring it back. And the Doctor instructs the gang to trigger more memories. And Sarah Jane has flashbacks of practically every episode up to this point. Santiago tells Joe to remember all the countries she's seen. And she says, oh, every country in the world, and that's accompanied with some more kind of David Attenborough stock footage looking flashbacks that don't really fit in, but okay, fair enough. There's a really big shower of sparks, and then the weave is kaput, and it allows Sarah Jane to pull her headband off and run over to free Joe. Now, the memory weave is more than just kaput. It's going to detonate. There are flames, if we've got pyrotechnics budget. There's sparks, everything. Kareem's panel to open the door, it's just a shower of sparks, it's broken. It actually zaps her, she ends up on the floor. Sarah Jane runs over to the door, tries to sonic it, only to find out that her sonic lipstick is drained. To be fair, we've seen it used perhaps the most in this episode than any other, when they were putting together that teleporter machine on the Crimson Planet. Which, hang on, is that the title of another episode? I imagine at this point everything's the title of an episode. But it was going, ends up there, ends up there, ends up there, ends up there. Like, she's drained her sonic lipstick. And the Doctor says that his sonic is in the TARDIS. So that's the explanation. He must have left it in the TARDIS, and then when the Shansheath took the TARDIS, they just coincidentally took his sonic screwdriver. Sarah Jane reflects on the irony that they could really do with the key to the TARDIS because they stopped themselves from getting the key to the TARDIS. Joe says, I came here to attend the Doctor's funeral, now it's going to be mine. And that sparks a brainwave. And they quickly run and get inside that coffin that has just been moved to the side in the room. Now, Kareem, still struggling, lying on the floor, with flames all around her, she reaches out to them. But, I mean, it's a one-person coffin and you're already fitting two people in there. I doubt there's that much room in there anyway. The Shen Sheath hammer on the door of the TARDIS to no avail, and the room goes boom. It blows the doors of the room clean off. Pyrotechnics budget through the roof. There's a proper fireball. Big drama times. I don't think we had a fireball like that since the pilot, when they blew up the bubble shop factory. Now the Doctor just twigs something that Ronnie said to Sarah Jane when getting her to remember past adventures, and he asks her, "Wait, what do you mean the Mona Lisa?" Because Russell T Davies cannot resist alluding to the fact that the Fourth Doctor dealt with the Mona Lisa in City of Death. They enter the room. Groski states that it smells like chicken, alluding to the three Shen Sheath that have just been very rapidly fried. They open the coffin to find Sarah Jane and Joe hugging each other, very happy to be alive. They start laughing with the sort of release of tension of it all, having a lovely time. There are 4 charred corpses in this room. There are 3 Shen Sheath, and there is 1 human lady. So we're not going to find out why she wanted to leave Earth after all. Big, big shame. We don't see the corpses, of course. There's pesky laws about traumatizing children again. But I'm not sure if we've had such an explicit death since the kids that Odd Bob killed. And even then, this is way more in your face than that was. I mean, geez. But we cut to 13 Bannerman Road. The TARDIS materializes in there, which activates Mr. Smith. So I suppose that's going in my supercut, because it's a supercut of every Mr. Smith activation I think I'm doing, and deactivation as well. And so a lot of the time that's triggered by Mr. Smith, I need you, but I'm throwing in some other things for flavour. And I mean, hey, at least you don't have to worry about keeping him a secret, given that the only unit officer who knew about him is now charred to a crisp. Let's not move on from the fact that we've just witnessed a horrible, horrible death or 4. And let's not move on from that as quickly as this show does, because blimey. But I mean, I guess on the topic of rogue people, Ronnie comes out the TARDIS and admonishes Mr. Smith for not knowing that the Shen Sheath were bad. And he says, hey, overall, they're known to be pretty good. This was a rogue element. I've just received an apology for their behaviour from the high wing of the Shen Sheath, actually. Now, Santiago, who's just had a trip in the TARDIS, which I could argue is significantly more impressive than Mr. Smith, is still very excited about Mr. Smith. So Ronnie and Clyde introduce him as Sarah Jane and Joe stay on board for a moment, talking to the Doctor. And it's that old 11th Doctor TARDIS set, my favourite. I drew it once, actually. I used it in a cover of a Doctor Who annual, probably 2011 for reference. I don't know where that drawing is now. But Joe says, I should probably get going, otherwise I'm going to end up staying in here forever. Plus, I probably couldn't keep up anymore. I'd get you in trouble with all the Time Lords. Ooh. The Doctor gives a bit of a 1,000-yard stare there for a moment. Sarah Jane mentions the theory that they'd be able to feel it if he died, and she says that's probably a bit silly, isn't it? The Doctor says it's not, because should the day of my death ever come, I reckon the whole universe might just shiver, which is quite boastful. Not necessarily untrue, but they're hooked on his every word. He says it with such drama, such gravity to it. He knows this. He takes the opportunity to make them jump. He's kind of incapable of being serious, and it's very much a bit of a defense mechanism. But he gives both of them a hug goodbye. They step out. The TARDIS dematerializes. Outside, Clyde, Ronnie, and Santiago chat once again about how Santiago doesn't really have any home to go to, constantly travelling. That's rather like the Doctor. And out comes Joe, giving her farewells, wondering where she's put her glasses, which apparently a reference to when the actress Katie Manning turned up at her audition to play Jo for the very first time without her glasses and had trouble reading the script. Ronnie asks about the Doctor's old companions, and Sarah Jane says, well, I've done a little bit of searching, and I found this lady called Tegan. So that'd be Tegan Jovanka, companion of the fourth and fifth Doctors, presumably after Sarah Jane. So I think there's probably more people mixed in there as well, but in order to go, Liz, Jo, Sarah Jane, Tegan. But of course, more people before and after and in between. Um, but Tegan is in Australia, and she's campaigning for the rights of Aboriginal people. That's quite neat. Um, Ben and Polly, companions to the first and second Doctor, who we must have seen most recently in 12's Regeneration episode, where they remake 1's Regeneration at the start. Uh, they're running an orphanage in India. Harry Sullivan, companion of the fourth Doctor, who met Sarah Jane. Sarah Jane says, "Oh, I loved Harry. Uh, he was a doctor who did great work with vaccines." Um, Her speaking about him in the past tense as opposed to all the others with what they're currently doing implies that he has now died. Sarah Jane says there was a woman called Dorothy. She runs a charitable Earth. A charitable Earth. Huh? ACE. Dorothy, of course, is the first name of Ace, companion to the seventh Doctor. Now, Sophie Aldred, who plays Ace, actually said that she'd rather that the charity be a front for something, because Ace wasn't really the sort to settle down, and charity work, while noble, it was not really as exciting enough for Ace. So, then in a couple of Big Finish audio dramas, I believe, they do hint that there's more to it than meets the eye, which is quite neat. And then there's Ian and Barbara, companions of the first Doctor. Sarah Jane gives them both Ian's surname, Chesterton, implying that they got married, and she says that there's a rumour that they haven't aged since the 60s. Now, once again, this went way over my head as a little kid, but as far as I can tell, there were some books that came out that gave a lot of the companions bad endings. Sort of when Doctor Who went off the air, and there was those however many years between then and 2005 where the license was just kind of okay. Well, we're not making TV anymore, but we have books and books and books and all these sort of pseudo canonical books came out, and this is Russell T Davies's chance to go, haha, my TV spin off is a bit more canon than those books are. Let me do a bit of rewriting some history. Now, it does feel a bit much to have it all sort of happen right here in this one episode, right? Not even spread over the episode, it all kind of is dumped right at the end. But it does kind of honour them in a sweet way. And that's pretty much where we roll our credits. And then we get our next time, which I'll talk about. Now, overall, pretty good. Pretty enjoyable. Always good to have the Doctor appear, because he never disappoints. Lovely to see Katie Manning as Jo Grant. The ending was solid enough. I mean, we had mind power and hiding in a coffin. That's par for the course. That is what this show is about. Big explosion, hide in the coffin to get away from it. You've triggered the explosion with the power of your mind and how much you can remember and the wonderful things you've seen. It's Doctor Who, that's Sarah Jane Adventures. That's what this show is about. If you like that, that's what it is. If you don't like it, you're probably not a Whovian. And, I think this episode is just kind of a bit of solid sci-fi. I think over this series overall as well, if this is your sort of thing, then this is the series for you. Because before, we were either going crazy deep, impossible, like emotions showing the real depth that a kid's show can get to, and then the next episode would kind of just miss the mark entirely. It would be good, but then the ending it'd just be we've kind of screwed up here. And with this series, we haven't really got any real deep, crazy emotions. I mean, we've had grief, but it was kind of, I don't really believe it that the Doctor's dead, and then the Doctor wasn't dead. So, we haven't really had the grief like we had in The Temptation of Sarah Jane, I think that one was called. But we're just getting really good episodes. I really like them. And spoiler alert, there is a bit more of an emotional one to come actually. But it's got a certain point in it, at least. It's an episode that I've been itching to tell you about as well. But there are 3 more episodes in this series, so we've got to get there first. And next time, it seems like everyone's disappeared except Clyde and Rani. So I hope you'll join me there.